I need to read the skill file and then write the story based on the analysis. Let me check the names to avoid first, then write the story directly. Names to avoid: Raymond, Renata, Sophie, Marcus, Frank Calloway, Daniel, Carla, Patricia. Now I'll write the full story. I'm 71 years old, and I still remember exactly what the snow looked like that evening. Fat, wet flakes coming down so thick you could barely see the end of the driveway. I remember thinking it was beautiful. I remember thinking a lot of stupid things that night. My name is Gerald McDonald. For 38 years, I worked as a cardiovascular surgeon at St. Augustine Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. I saved lives for a living. I held people's hearts in my hands, literally, and kept them beating. I retired at 68 with a clean record, a small collection of commendations I never hung up, and a house I'd paid off 20 years earlier. Nothing extravagant. 4 bedrooms, a garden my late wife Helen loved more than she loved me, and a detached garage where I kept her old Buick because I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Helen passed in 2019. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Even with everything I knew about medicine, even with every connection I had, there was nothing to do. You learn, when you lose someone like that knowledge and helplessness are not opposites. You can understand exactly what's happening, and still be completely powerless to stop it. After she died, my son Aaron was wonderful. He came home every other weekend. He called twice a week. He brought food, helped me sort through her things, cried with me in the kitchen when we found her recipe box tucked behind the stand mixer. That was Aaron, my boy, the one I coached through Little League, even though he threw like he was afraid of the ball. The one I sat up with through 3 nights of pneumonia when he was 9, the one I helped move into 4 different apartments across 2 states before he finally settled in Dayton with a job in commercial real estate. That was Aaron before Melissa. He met her at a charity auction in the spring of 2021. She was pretty and sharp-tongued and laughed at everything he said, and I could see immediately that he was completely undone by her. I didn't say anything negative. I'd learned enough from Helen about when to speak and when to simply observe. I told him she seemed lively. I told him I was happy he was happy. Both of those things were technically true. They married 14 months later. Small wedding, which I actually appreciated. I paid for the venue, a renovated barn outside of Yellow Springs, without being asked, because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because Aaron mentioned twice that the deposit was more than he expected. Melissa thanked me at the reception with a hug that lasted about 1 second, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I filed that away and said nothing. The first year was fine, mostly. Aaron still called, though less often. He still came by, though always with her now, and her presence had a way of changing the texture of a room. She wasn't rude, exactly. She was careful. Everything she said to me was perfectly pleasant on the surface. "How are you feeling, Gerald? You look tired, Gerald. You should really let us know if you need help with anything." And underneath every word was something I couldn't quite name, but that made me feel, each time they left, like I'd been assessed. I found out what she was assessing in the fall of 2022. Aaron called me on a Tuesday evening and asked if I'd thought about estate planning. I told him I had a will, updated after Helen died, and that everything was in order. He said that was good, that he just wanted to make sure. He said Melissa had mentioned that some of her friends' parents had run into complications, and he just wanted to be certain I wasn't going to leave a mess. I told him I was a cardiovascular surgeon, not a reckless person, and that there would be no mess. He laughed and said of course he knew that. 2 weeks later, he called again. He asked if I'd considered that maybe keeping the house was unnecessary, now that it was just me. He said a smaller place would be easier to manage. He said maybe a nice retirement community, somewhere with activities. I told him I was 70 years old, not 90, and that I walked 3 miles every morning and grew my own tomatoes and had no interest in a retirement community. He backed off, but there was a pressure behind the conversation that hadn't been there before, and I knew exactly where it was coming from. That winter, Melissa started coming alone sometimes. Aaron would be working, she said. She'd stop by with a casserole or a coffee, and she'd sit in my kitchen and talk. About nothing in particular, it seemed, but I started noticing the pattern. She always eventually mentioned the house. How big it was for one person. How valuable the property had become with the neighborhood changing. How lucky I was to have something like this to leave behind. She said it the way people talk about things they've already decided belong to them. In March of 2023, Aaron called me and said he and Melissa were having some financial difficulty. A deal had fallen through. They were behind on their mortgage. He wasn't asking for anything, he said. He just wanted me to know. I transferred $40,000 into his account within the week because he was my son and I loved him, and because I still believed, at that point, that I understood what was happening. What was happening was that Melissa had been telling Aaron things about me. I didn't know this yet. I would only find out much later, in a courtroom, exactly what she'd been saying. That I was becoming erratic. That I'd made comments that worried her. That she was concerned about my decision-making. That maybe his father wasn't as sharp as he used to be. She was patient about it. She didn't say it all at once. She planted it slowly, the way you plant something you intend to harvest. By the fall of 2023, Aaron had changed. It's hard to describe the change in a person you've known since they were small. It's not like a switch being flipped. It's more like a fog rolling in. Gradual. Then suddenly you can't see the person you used to know at all. He stopped calling as often. When he did call, there was a formality to it, like he was checking a box. He stopped coming by on his own. When I suggested getting together, he said he'd have to check with Melissa about the schedule. I didn't argue. I told myself it was normal. Marriage changes people's rhythms. I gave him room. In November, I asked if he and Melissa wanted to come for Thanksgiving. He said they'd already made plans with her family. He said it in a way that made clear he wasn't sorry about it. I spent Thanksgiving alone that year, which was fine. I cooked a small chicken and watched a documentary about deep-sea fish and went to bed early. The silence in the house was the kind that is weight. December was when things moved quickly. Aaron came to see me on a Saturday without Melissa, which I thought was a good sign. I made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and didn't take his coat off. That should have told me something. He said he and Melissa had been talking. He said they were concerned about my long-term situation. He said the house was too large and too expensive to maintain, and that it made more sense for me to consider my options. He used the phrase, "consider your options," 4 times in 20 minutes. I counted. I asked him what options he meant, specifically. He said selling the house was one possibility. He said that with the equity, I could move somewhere more manageable and still have money left. He said the rest could be invested smartly for my care needs down the line. He said Melissa had done some research. I looked at my son across the kitchen table and I asked him, very calmly, whose idea this was. He said it was both of theirs. I asked him if he believed I was incapable of managing my own affairs. He got defensive. He said that wasn't what he was saying. I told him I was a retired cardiovascular surgeon with a fully intact mind, 0 debt, and a financial advisor I'd had for 22 years, and that I didn't need research done on my behalf by Melissa. He stood up and said I was being difficult. He said this was exactly the problem. He said Melissa had warned him I'd react this way. He left. I stood at the window and watched his car back out of the driveway, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Helen's funeral. The specific loneliness of losing someone who is still alive. I called my attorney the following Monday. Her name is Joanne Whitfield, and she's been my lawyer for 19 years, and she is not a person who wastes words. I told her what was happening. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me one question. Did Aaron have any legal standing over my affairs currently? I told her no. She said then we were going to make sure it stayed that way, and she walked me through a comprehensive review of my estate documents, a new power of attorney designation, updated beneficiary listings, and a trust structure that would make it extremely difficult for anyone to contest my decisions or claim I lacked capacity. We finished the paperwork in early December. I did not tell Aaron. What happened on December 19th is something I've replayed so many times it has the quality of a film I've memorized, but still can't quite believe. Aaron called me that evening. He said Melissa had been in contact with someone, a social worker, he said, or something like that, and that there were concerns about my living situation. He said they felt it would be best if I came and stayed with them for a while so they could make sure I was okay. He said this was coming from a place of love. I told him I was fine and I wasn't going anywhere. He said I was being stubborn. I told him I was being rational. He raised his voice. I don't remember exactly what was said after that. The conversation became something that sounded less like a son and father and more like a negotiation that had already been decided. At some point he said, and I remember this precisely, "Dad, I don't know how to make you understand that this isn't working anymore." I told him I understood perfectly. He hung up. 20 minutes later, I heard his car in the driveway. He had a key. I'd given him one years ago, for emergencies. He used it. He came in with Melissa behind him, and she stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, while he walked into the living room and told me I needed to come with them. I asked him if I was being kidnapped. He said I was being dramatic. I looked at Melissa and she looked back at me with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. Aaron picked up the bag I kept packed by the door, an old habit from years of hospital on-call, and he carried it out to the car. He said the neighbors had called him. He said I'd been seen outside looking confused. This was a complete fabrication. I had been outside that morning checking on the gutters, fully dressed, fully coherent, talking to my neighbor Ted Ferris, who later signed an affidavit confirming exactly that. But I didn't know about any of that yet. I was standing in my own living room at 71, I keep making that mistake, watching my son pick up my bag like I was a child being collected from somewhere I shouldn't be, and I made a decision in that moment that I don't fully understand even now. I decided to go, not because I was confused or scared, because I wanted to see how far this would go. I got in the car. Melissa drove. We didn't go to their house in Dayton. We drove for about 40 minutes and then turned into a parking lot I didn't recognize at first, a medical facility of some kind. Low building, fluorescent lights, a few cars. I asked what this was. Aaron said it was just a place where someone could talk to me and make sure I was okay. A wellness check, he called it. I asked him if he was having me committed. He said that was a dramatic way to put it. It was not a dramatic way to put it. The woman at the intake desk was kind and confused in equal measure. She asked me some questions, and I answered them. The date, the current president, the address of my childhood home, the name of my late wife, the number of chambers in the human heart. I answered everything correctly, and with some additional context the checklist hadn't asked for. After about 15 minutes, she stepped out and came back and said there was no basis for an involuntary hold. She said I was, in her professional opinion, completely oriented and appropriate. Aaron's face in that moment is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Melissa touched his arm and said something quietly. He shook his head. I stood up, put on my coat, and asked them to take me home. They didn't take me home. Aaron said there was a storm coming, which was true. The forecast had been tracking it for days, and that it would be better if I stayed somewhere tonight. He said they'd booked me a room at a hotel nearby, just for the evening, until the roads cleared. He handed me a keycard. He said the room was paid for. He said he'd call me in the morning. He didn't look at me when he said it. Melissa was already walking toward the exit. I stood in the parking lot of that facility in the snow in December, at 71 years old, holding a hotel keycard, watching my son's taillights disappear. The snow was coming down hard by then. The parking lot was empty except for 2 cars and a light post doing its best. I didn't cry. I'm not sure what I felt exactly. Something very quiet and very cold that had nothing to do with the weather. I did not go to the hotel. I called my attorney. Joanne Whitfield answered on the second ring, even though it was almost 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in December. And when I told her where I was and what had just happened, she didn't say anything for a moment. And then she said, "Gerald, are you somewhere warm?" I told her I was standing in a parking lot. She told me to go inside and wait, and that she would handle everything from there. I went back inside. The woman at the intake desk let me sit in the waiting area. She brought me a cup of coffee without being asked, which I appreciated more than I can say. What Joanne did over the next 6 hours is the kind of thing you pay a very good attorney for and then spend years being grateful about. She contacted the county sheriff's office and reported what had happened. An elderly person left in a parking lot in a winter storm. She contacted Ted Ferris, my neighbor, who confirmed the timeline of what I'd actually been doing that morning. She pulled together the documentation from the intake assessment showing I'd passed every cognitive test, and she reached out to my financial advisor, who confirmed that he'd spoken with me twice in the past week about routine portfolio matters and that I had been, in his words, as sharp as ever. By 2 in the morning, law enforcement had made contact with Aaron. I don't know what that conversation's like. I wasn't there. But I know Aaron called me at 2:17 in the morning, and when I answered, still in the waiting room, still drinking the terrible coffee, his voice sounded like someone had taken all the air out of him. He said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." I didn't say anything. He said, I thought, Melissa told me." I said, "I know what Melissa told you." He started to cry. I sat there and listened to my son cry into the phone from a plastic chair in a medical facility, waiting room at 2 in the morning in December, and I thought about all the times I had sat up with him when he was sick, and the Little League games, and the apartment moves, and Thanksgiving, and the day Helen died, and he held my hand in the hospital parking lot and didn't say a word because there was nothing to say. I thought about all of that. I said, "We're going to talk, but not tonight." He said, "Okay." I said, "Go home, Aaron." He said, "Melissa." I said, "I know." What came out in the following weeks and months is something I'll try to summarize without letting the anger back in, because the anger doesn't help me anymore, and I spent enough of last year keeping it company. Melissa had, over the course of approximately 18 months, been systematically attempting to have me declared incompetent. Not through any official medical channel, she didn't have the standing for that, but through a campaign of suggestion. She had told Aaron I was forgetting things. She had told him I'd called her by the wrong name twice. She had told him a neighbor had mentioned I'd been seen wandering. None of it was true. All of it was designed to make Aaron believe that his father was slipping away, that there was a window, and if they didn't act now, they'd lose access to the estate before I made decisions they couldn't undo. What she hadn't known, what Aaron hadn't known, was that I'd already made those decisions. The trust was airtight. Joanne had made certain of that. The primary beneficiary of my estate, after certain specific items bequeathed to people I love, was the Helen MacDonald Foundation, a small charitable organization I'd set up in my wife's name to fund nursing scholarships at the university where she'd done her postgraduate work. It had existed for 2 years. I'd been quietly endowing it. Aaron didn't know because Aaron hadn't asked about anything real in almost 2 years. He'd only asked about the house. The house was in the trust. It could not be sold, transferred, or claimed outside the terms I'd set. Not by Aaron, not by anyone. When Joanne communicated all of this formally, through her office, to Aaron's attorney, yes, he had retained one, which tells you something about how this was supposed to go. The response on the other end was silence, and then a short email saying Aaron wished to arrange a time to speak with me. Melissa, to no one's surprise, retained a separate attorney. What followed was a legal process I won't walk you through in detail because, frankly, it bored me and I spent most of it working in the garden. The short version is this. Melissa had, in her communications, texts, emails, a voicemail Joanne managed to preserve, made statements that constituted attempted financial fraud against a vulnerable adult. Ohio takes that seriously. The prosecutor who was assigned to the case was a woman named Sandra Okafor, who I met once and who struck me as the kind of person who finishes what she starts. Melissa accepted a plea agreement. 14 months and significant financial restitution. Her attorney argued she'd been acting out of misguided concern. Sandra Okafor disagreed on record, and the judge agreed with Sandra Okafor. Aaron was not charged criminally. He had been manipulated, and while that doesn't erase what he did, it is a fact, and facts matter. What happened to Aaron was a different kind of consequence. Slower, quieter, and possibly longer lasting. He lost his job when the story became locally known. He and Melissa divorced before the plea was entered. He called me every week for 4 months before I agreed to meet him for coffee. We met at a diner near my house on a Wednesday morning in April. He looked 10 years older. He sat down across from me and he started to say something, and I stopped him. I told him I didn't need the speech. I told him I already knew he was sorry, and I already knew she'd worked on him for a long time, and I already knew he hadn't understood what he was participating in. I told him all of that was true, and none of it changed what happened in that parking lot in December. He nodded. He didn't argue. I told him I also knew that he was my son, and that his mother loved him with everything she had, and that for her sake as much as his, I wasn't going to let this be the end of the story. He started crying again right there in the diner, in front of a very startled waitress who handled it with real professionalism by simply refilling our coffee and saying nothing. We have a long way to go. I won't pretend otherwise. Trust is not a switch you flip back on. It has to be rebuilt the way you rebuild anything that's been damaged. Carefully, over time, with attention to the weak points. We have breakfast once a month. He calls twice a week. Some calls are easier than others. Last summer, I took Helen's old Buick out of the garage for the first time in 4 years and drove it down to Hocking Hills, where she and I used to go every fall. I hiked the trails I remembered. I sat by the creek for a long time and didn't think about anything in particular. On the way home, I stopped at a farm stand and bought 3 different kinds of squash, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the life I was living was still mine. I'm still in the house. The garden is doing well. I walk 3 miles every morning, and my knees inform me of their displeasure, and I inform them that I don't particularly care. The Helen McDonald Foundation awarded its 3rd round of nursing scholarships last spring. I attended the ceremony. 3 young women and 2 young men stood up in front of a small crowd and talked about what nursing school meant to them and what they hoped to do with it. And I sat in the 3rd row and thought about Helen, who would have cried through the whole thing and then denied it afterward. Someone told me recently, a neighbor at a block party, that what happened to me was a tragedy. I told them I disagreed. I told them what happened to me was a test, and I passed it. And now I know things I didn't know before. About my son, about myself, about what I built and what I'm willing to protect. That's not a tragedy. That's information. I'm 71 years old. I walked 3 miles this morning. I have tomatoes coming in that Helen would have said were the best I'd ever grown, and I think she would have been right. I have a foundation bearing her name that will outlast me. And I still have my house. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. They expect me to say the parking lot, the snow. Standing there alone at 71 with a hotel key card in my hand while my son's taillights disappeared into the dark. And yes, that was hard. That image has stayed with me in a way I suspect it always will. But the hardest part was earlier than that. The hardest part was sitting across from Aaron at my own kitchen table, watching him not take his coat off, and understanding that the person who had taught him to ride a bike and held his hand in hospital parking lots was now someone he'd been convinced to manage. That's the word Melissa used, I found out later. Manage. Like I was a problem with the solution she'd already identified. What I've come to understand, on the other side of all of it, is that what happened to my family wasn't random. It grew from something. Melissa didn't walk into Aaron's life and immediately begin dismantling his relationship with me. She was patient. She understood that trust, once built, has to be eroded slowly. A small doubt here. A quiet suggestion there. A version of his father that she fed him piece by piece until the picture she'd constructed replaced the real one. That takes time. It also takes a person who has decided that other people are resources rather than relationships. Aaron let it happen. I don't say that to punish him. I've already said I'm done with that. But it's true, and the truth of it matters because it points to something I think about often. He stopped asking questions. He stopped checking what he was being told against what he actually knew. He had decades of evidence about who I was, and he set it aside because it was easier, or because he was scared, or because he was scared, or because love can make you credulous in ways that nothing else can. I understand all of that. I also know that understanding why something happened doesn't mean pretending it didn't. What saved me, and I mean this without any dramatics, was that I had done the work before I needed it. I had updated my estate. I had retained Joanne. I had kept my own counsel when every instinct told me to confront and demand and make Aaron choose. I didn't know what was coming, but I had spent 38 years in medicine, and medicine teaches you one thing above everything else: prepare before the crisis, because during the crisis, you won't have time. That's not wisdom. That's just competence practiced over a long enough period that it starts to look like wisdom. I think about what would have happened if I'd been less careful. If I'd been the version of myself that Melissa was counting on, confused, isolated, dependent, easy to redirect. There are people in that situation. I've seen them. It doesn't make them weak. It makes them human. And it makes what was done to them worse, not better. I got out because I had resources and relationships and a 38-year habit of thinking clearly under pressure. Not everyone has that. That's worth sitting with. What I want Aaron to carry from this, and I've told him this directly, at that diner, over coffee, is that love without attention is not enough. You can love someone and still fail them completely, because you stopped paying attention to who they actually are. Melissa told him a story about his father, and he listened to the story instead of looking at his father. That's the thing I hope he fixes. Not for my sake anymore. For his own. I'm still in my house. The foundation still bears Helen's name. The tomatoes are still coming in. Whatever I lost in that parking lot in December, I didn't lose myself. And that, in the end, is the only thing that was ever really mine to protect.